In the waning years of the 6th century, as the Sui Dynasty consolidated its grip over a reunified China after centuries of division, Emperor Yang gazed northward across the Yalu River with eyes that burned with imperial ambition. The year was 598, and the Middle Kingdom had not known such unity since the fall of the Han 4 centuries prior. Yet for all his vast dominions stretching from the South China Sea to the Gobi Desert, one thorn remained embedded in the dragon's side: the defiant kingdom of Goguryeo, perched like an iron fortress across the Korean peninsula and southern Manchuria. Yang was not a man given to half measures. Born Yang Guang, second son of Emperor Wen, who had forged the Sui from the ashes of division, he possessed the ruthless calculation of a conqueror, wrapped in the silk robes of cultured refinement. His court chroniclers would later paint him as a monster, a tyrant whose megalomania brought down heaven's mandate. But in those early years of his reign, he appeared to many as the architect of a new golden age. The Grand Canal, that marvel of engineering ambition, snaked across his empire like a concrete testament to his vision, a liquid highway that would bind his realm together with bonds of commerce and control. Yet even as millions of peasants died constructing his aquatic masterpiece, Yang's gaze remained fixed on that stubborn northern kingdom that dared to exist beyond his dominion. Goguryeo was no mere barbarian chiefdom to be swept aside by imperial decree. For over 6 centuries, this Korean kingdom had carved out its existence in the harsh mountains and river valleys of the north, its warriors hardened by constant warfare against Chinese expansionism and nomadic raiders from the steppes. Under King Yongyang, Goguryeo had reached the zenith of its power, controlling territory that stretched from the Taedong River in the south to the Songhua River in the north, a realm encompassing much of modern-day North Korea and significant portions of Manchuria. Its capital at Pyongyang stood as a symbol of Korean independence, its massive walls and strategic position making it appear impregnable to Chinese eyes. But it was more than territorial ambition that drove Yang toward his fateful obsession. The very existence of an independent Goguryeo represented a gaping wound in the Chinese worldview, a fundamental challenge to the concept of Tianxia, the notion that all lands under heaven owed fealty to the Son of Heaven. How could Yang claim to rule a truly unified empire when a significant portion of what the Chinese considered their rightful sphere remained beyond their grasp? Moreover, Goguryeo controlled the vital trade routes that connected China with the profitable markets of Manchuria and the maritime kingdoms beyond. Silk, furs, precious metals, and exotic goods flowed through Goguryeo's territory, enriching Korean coffers, while Chinese merchants paid tribute for safe passage. The first whispers of war began in the Imperial Council chambers, where Yang's advisors painted vivid pictures of the wealth and strategic advantages that would flow from Goguryeo's conquest. General Yang Su, the emperor's most trusted military commander, spoke of the kingdom's supposed weakness, its forces scattered across too wide a frontier, its people allegedly yearning for the enlightened rule of Chinese civilization. Intelligence reports, filtered through layers of courtly optimism and imperial wishful thinking, suggested that Goguryeo's defenses were crumbling, that a swift campaign might topple the entire kingdom with minimal effort. Yet there were voices of caution, though they spoke in whispers that grew fainter with each passing month. The aged counselor Gao Jiong, hero of the reunification wars, warned that Korea's mountains and rivers formed natural fortifications that had swallowed Chinese armies before. The terrain itself was treacherous narrow valleys where cavalry could not maneuver, swift rivers that could become torrents with the spring rains, and mountain passes where a few hundred defenders could hold off thousands. More ominously, he reminded the court of the logistical nightmare that would inevitably unfold. Feeding an army large enough to conquer Goguryeo across hundreds of miles of hostile territory would require supply lines stretching longer than any the Chinese had ever attempted to maintain. But Yang's mind was already made up, and in the imperial system, the emperor's will became cosmic law. The machinery of war began its inexorable grinding in the spring of 598, as conscription orders flowed out from the capital like a plague. From the rice paddies of the south to the wheat fields of the north, young men were torn from their families and herded into training camps. The lucky ones would serve as infantry, carrying spears and shields in the great phalanxes that had dominated Chinese warfare for centuries. Others would join the engineering corps, tasked with building the bridges and siege engines that would, in theory, crack open Goguryeo's fortifications. The unlucky majority would serve as laborers, human pack animals, whose job was to carry the mountains of grain, weapons, and supplies that a massive army would devour. The scale of mobilization was unprecedented in Chinese history. Court records, preserved despite the dynasty's eventual collapse, speak of over 300,000 combat troops assembled for the first invasion, supported by an additional 200,000 laborers and camp followers. To put this in perspective, the entire population of Chang'an, the Sui capital and one of the world's largest cities, numbered barely 400,000 souls. Yang was essentially mobilizing an army larger than his own capital city, a logistical undertaking that would have challenged even the Roman Empire at its height. The preparations consumed the better part of a year, as quartermasters struggled to accumulate the staggering quantities of supplies required. Conservative estimates suggest that each soldier needed at least 2 pounds of grain per day, meaning that the army would consume over 500,000 pounds of food daily, not counting the fodder required for tens of thousands of horses, oxen, and mules. Weapons had to be forged in quantities that stripped the empire's iron reserves, while the textile workshops worked around the clock to produce tents, clothing, and the countless other items an army required. The Grand Canal, Yang's pride and joy, groaned under the weight of supply barges carrying rice from the south and millet from the north toward the staging areas near the Korean border. Yet even as this mighty war machine took shape, ominous signs began to multiply like storm clouds on the horizon. The spring rains of 598 came early and with unusual fury, turning roads into quagmires and flooding the supply depots along the army's route. What should have been a swift march to the frontier became a grinding slog through knee-deep mud, with wagon trains bogging down and precious supplies spoiling in the constant downpour. Horses and oxen died by the thousands, either from disease or simple exhaustion, forcing soldiers to carry loads meant for pack animals. More terrifying still was the invisible enemy that began to stalk the Chinese ranks: epidemic disease. Medieval armies were breeding grounds for every form of plague and pestilence known to humanity, and the Sui force proved no exception. Dysentery spread through the camps like wildfire, leaving men weakened and demoralized even before they encountered the enemy. Typhus, carried by lice that thrived in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, claimed victims with ruthless efficiency. The army's physicians, trained in the theoretical medicine of classical texts, proved helpless against the practical reality of mass suffering. But perhaps most devastating of all was the growing realization among the common soldiers that they were marching toward almost certain death for a cause they barely understood. These were not professional warriors driven by martial pride or mercenaries motivated by the promise of plunder. They were farmers and craftsmen torn from their families, thrown together with strangers and ordered to conquer a land they knew only through fearsome rumors. Desertion became a constant problem, with entire units melting away in the night like morning mist. The punishment for desertion was death, but many men calculated that a swift execution was preferable to the slow agony of disease and starvation that awaited them in Korea. As the bedraggled Chinese army finally approached the Yalu River in the late autumn of 598, it bore little resemblance to the magnificent force that had departed from the capital months earlier. Disease and desertion had reduced its effective strength by perhaps a third, while the constant struggle against the elements had sapped the morale of even the most dedicated soldiers. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through hostile territory, vulnerable to interdiction by Goguryeo raiders who had been watching the Chinese preparations with growing alarm. King Yongyang of Goguryeo was no passive observer of these developments. His spies and scouts had been tracking the Chinese army's approach for months, sending back detailed reports of its composition, condition, and most importantly, its vulnerabilities. Unlike his Chinese counterpart, Yongyang understood that this was not a war that could be won through pitched battles and grand gestures. Goguryeo's strength lay not in massive armies, but in superior knowledge of the terrain, the fierce loyalty of its people, and the timeless defensive advantages enjoyed by those fighting for their homeland. The Goguryeo strategy was elegantly simple in concept, but devastatingly effective in execution. Rather than meet the Chinese in open battle where superior numbers might tell, the Korean forces would engage in what modern military theorists would recognize as classic asymmetric warfare. Small, highly mobile units would harass Chinese supply lines, appearing suddenly from hidden mountain paths to strike at vulnerable wagon trains before melting back into the landscape like ghosts. Fortified positions would be defended only as long as they could inflict maximum casualties on the attackers before being abandoned for the next prepared position. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, every village would exact its toll in Chinese blood. As winter settled over the borderlands like a blanket of ice and snow, the true magnitude of Yang's folly began to reveal itself. The Chinese army, designed for swift conquest, found itself trapped in a war of attrition for which it was utterly unprepared. Supply lines that had barely functioned in good weather collapsed entirely under the weight of winter storms. Frostbite claimed more victims than enemy arrows, while the constant stress of guerrilla attacks left the survivors jumpy and demoralized. The final blow came not from Goguryeo spears, but from the simple arithmetic of logistics. By early 599, it became clear that the army was consuming supplies far faster than they could be replaced. The alternatives were stark: retreat immediately and preserve what remained of the force, or continue the campaign and risk the complete destruction of the army through starvation and exposure. Even Yang, for all his imperial arrogance, could not ignore the reports flooding back from his commanders in the field. The withdrawal was a nightmare that would haunt Chinese military planning for generations to come. What had been an organized retreat quickly devolved into a rout as discipline collapsed and units disintegrated. Goguryeo forces, sensing weakness, pressed their attacks with renewed vigor, turning the Chinese retreat into a running battle that stretched across hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland. Thousands of Chinese soldiers simply vanished into the Korean mountains, their fate unknown but easily imagined. When the remnants of the Great Army finally stumbled back across the Chinese border in the spring of 599, they bore witness to one of the most complete military disasters in Chinese history. Of the 500,000 men who had marched north with such confidence barely a year earlier, fewer than half returned. The survivors were broken men, physically and spiritually shattered by their ordeal, their stories of Korean mountains and Goguryeo warriors spreading terror through the Chinese ranks. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of this first campaign was that it represented only the beginning of Yang's obsession, not its end. The emperor, rather than learning from the catastrophe, became even more determined to vindicate his vision through force of arms. In the imperial palace, as courtiers whispered behind silk screens and eunuchs plotted in shadowed corridors, plans were already taking shape for an even more massive assault on the stubborn kingdom that had dared to humiliate the Son of Heaven. The stage was set for an escalation that would ultimately consume not just armies, but entire dynasties, a conflict whose reverberations would reshape the political landscape of East Asia for centuries to come. The dragon had tasted defeat, and its rage would shake the foundations of heaven itself. The humiliation of 598 should have been a sobering lesson, a divine warning that even the Son of Heaven must bow before the immutable laws of geography and logistics. But Emperor Yang possessed the particular blindness that afflicts those born to absolute power, the inability to conceive that the universe might not bend to their will. In the aftermath of the first disaster, as the broken survivors staggered back to their villages, bearing tales of Korean mountains that swallowed armies and winters that froze men's souls in their bodies, Yang retreated into the marble halls of his palace and began to dream of an even more magnificent revenge. The years between 599 and 612 were a fever dream of preparation, as the emperor marshaled the resources of his vast empire for what he envisioned as the final solution to the Goguryeo problem. This would not be merely another campaign. It would be a demonstration of Chinese power so overwhelming, so absolute, that it would echo through the ages as proof of the Middle Kingdom's divine mandate. Yang's court astronomers, those masters of flattery disguised as scholarship, proclaimed that the stars themselves had aligned to favor the emperor's great undertaking. The auguries were unanimous. Heaven had decreed that the troublesome northern kingdom must fall. Yet even as Yang indulged in these grandiose fantasies, the practical mechanics of his obsession were consuming the Sui Dynasty like a cancer. The emperor's demand for an army of unprecedented size required mobilization on a scale that defied comprehension. From every corner of the empire, men were torn from their fields and workshops, their families left to face starvation while they served the emperor's ambition. The conscription notices fell like snow across the provinces, each one a death sentence for households already pushed to the breaking point by imperial taxation and the endless demands of public works projects. The numbers, when finally tallied by the imperial bureaucracy, stagger belief even by the standards of Chinese hyperbole. Over 1.13 million combat troops would march under the imperial banners, supported by an additional 600,000 laborers, engineers, and camp followers. To put this astronomical figure in perspective, Yang was mobilizing a force larger than the entire population of most contemporary kingdoms. The logistics alone represented a challenge that would have daunted Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, feeding, clothing, and moving nearly 2 million men across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The emperor's obsession with numerical supremacy extended to every aspect of the campaign. His generals, competing for imperial favor, proposed ever more elaborate schemes for transporting supplies and reinforcements. The Grand Canal, that monument to Yang's engineering ambition, would serve as the primary artery for moving grain from the fertile south to the staging areas in the north. Hundreds of thousands of boats and barges were requisitioned, their civilian crews pressed into imperial service, whether they wished it or not. The canal itself groaned under this unprecedented burden, as traffic jams lasting for days created bottlenecks that delayed crucial supplies. But it was not merely the scale of the undertaking that made it so perilous. It was the fundamental disconnect between imperial ambition and practical reality. Yang and his courtiers, insulated by luxury and sycophancy from the harsh truths of logistics, genuinely believed that their superior numbers would simply overwhelm any resistance. They envisioned vast Chinese columns sweeping across the Korean peninsula like an unstoppable tide, brushing aside Goguryeo defenders through sheer mass. The possibility that size itself might become a weakness, that a million-man army might prove less effective than a smaller, more manageable force, never seemed to occur to them. The preparations consumed nearly a decade, as the imperial machinery ground through the impossible task of equipping and organizing this vast host. Weaponsmiths worked around the clock, their furnaces glowing like fallen stars in the darkness, as they forged the millions of spear points, arrowheads, and sword blades that would arm Yang's legions. The empire's textile workshops operated at maximum capacity, producing the countless uniforms, tents, and banners that would clothe and shelter the army. Even the imperial treasuries, swollen with decades of taxation and tribute, began to show signs of strain as the costs mounted beyond all previous experience. Meanwhile, across the Yalu River, King Yongyang and his generals watched these preparations with a mixture of alarm and grim satisfaction. The Goguryeo intelligence network, honed by centuries of survival against Chinese aggression, provided detailed reports of Yang's mobilization effort. Korean spies, disguised as merchants and pilgrims, moved freely through Chinese territories, noting the locations of supply depots, the conditions of roads and bridges, and most importantly, the growing discontent among the Chinese population as the emperor's demands grew ever more onerous. Yongyang understood, perhaps better than Yang himself, the true nature of the challenge that lay ahead. This would not be a war decided by single battles or heroic charges, but a contest of endurance, a race between Chinese ambition and the iron realities of distance, terrain, and time. Goguryeo strategy remained fundamentally defensive, but with subtle innovations that reflected hard-learned lessons from the previous campaign. Rather than trying to hold every piece of territory, Korean forces would trade space for time, drawing the massive Chinese army ever deeper into the peninsula's treacherous interior. The Korean preparations were a study in efficiency born of desperation. Unable to match Chinese numbers, Goguryeo focused on maximizing the effectiveness of every available man. Veterans of the previous war trained new recruits in the art of guerrilla warfare, teaching them to move like shadows through the mountain forests and strike like lightning at vulnerable supply trains. Fortifications were strengthened not to withstand lengthy sieges, which Goguryeo could not afford, but to extract maximum casualties from Chinese assault forces before being abandoned for the next prepared position. Most crucially, the Koreans had learned to weaponize their homeland's geography. Engineers worked tirelessly to identify every natural choke point, every river crossing where a small force might hold up a vast army. Dams were secretly constructed upstream from likely battlefield, ready to unleash artificial floods at crucial moments. Mountain passes were mined with hidden obstacles and prepared for demolition. The peninsula itself would become a giant trap, with each step northward drawing the Chinese army deeper into terrain increasingly favorable to defenders. As 612 dawned, Yang declared that the moment of destiny had arrived. The emperor, now in his late 30s and conscious that his reign would be judged by the success or failure of this grand enterprise, made the unprecedented decision to personally lead the campaign. No Chinese emperor in living memory had taken the field in person, and Yang's announcement sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Some courtiers praised their sovereign's martial spirit, while others whispered darkly about the precedent of rulers who died far from home. The emperor's decision to lead from the front was partly born of genuine martial ambition, but also reflected his growing distrust of his own generals. The previous campaign's failure had been blamed on incompetent field commanders, and Yang was determined not to allow victory to slip away through the timidity or treachery of subordinates. He would be present at every crucial decision, his imperial presence inspiring his troops to superhuman efforts while terrifying the enemy into submission. The Great Army began its march in the spring of 612, and for a brief moment, it must have seemed as if Yang's dreams might actually come to pass. The sight of nearly 2 million men on the move was genuinely awesome, a river of humanity and steel that stretched from horizon to horizon. Chinese chroniclers, writing in the flowery prose demanded by imperial propaganda, described columns so vast that their vanguard reached the Korean border while their rear guard was still leaving the capital. Banners fluttered like a forest of silk in the spring breeze, while the thunder of marching feet and rolling wagon wheels could be heard from miles away. Yet even in those early, hopeful days, careful observers might have noticed the signs of coming disaster. The army moved with glacial slowness, its enormous size making rapid maneuver impossible. Traffic jams were constant as different units competed for road space, while the sheer logistics of feeding and watering so many men and animals created bottlenecks that sometimes lasted for days. Discipline, never easy to maintain in such a massive force, began to fray almost immediately as soldiers from different regions and social classes found themselves thrown together in conditions of increasing hardship. The supply situation, supposedly resolved through years of careful planning, revealed its fundamental flaws within weeks of the campaign's start. The carefully calculated rations proved inadequate when confronted with the reality of men engaged in strenuous physical activity over extended periods. Waste and spoilage, minor concerns in peacetime logistics, became major problems when multiplied across nearly 2 million mouths. Most devastatingly, the assumption that local resources could supplement the army's supplies proved wildly optimistic once the force entered Korean territory, where a hostile population had removed or destroyed anything of potential value to invaders. As the Great Army crossed the Yalu River and entered Goguryeo territory proper, the first cracks in Yang's grand strategy became apparent. The Korean defenders, rather than meeting the Chinese in the pitched battles that Yang's generals had anticipated, seemed to melt away like morning mist. Scouting parties reported empty villages and abandoned fortifications, but no sign of the enemy army that intelligence had suggested would make its stand at the border. This apparent Korean timidity initially encouraged the Chinese commanders, who interpreted it as evidence that their overwhelming numbers had already achieved the desired psychological effect. In reality, Goguryeo forces were executing a carefully planned withdrawal, drawing the massive Chinese army ever deeper into terrain of their choosing. Korean cavalry units, operating in small groups that could move far faster than Yang's lumbering host, maintained constant surveillance of Chinese movements while avoiding direct engagement. These mounted scouts were the eyes and ears of the Korean resistance, reporting back to their commanders with detailed intelligence about Chinese strength, disposition, and most importantly, the growing signs of logistical strain that were beginning to manifest throughout the invasion force. The first major engagement came at the fortress of Liaodong, a massive stone citadel that commanded one of the main routes into the Korean interior. Yang's generals, confident in their superior numbers and siege equipment, anticipated that the fortress would fall within days of their arrival. Instead, they found themselves confronting one of the most sophisticated defensive systems in East Asia, a maze of interlocking walls, towers, and hidden passages that had been refined through centuries of warfare. The siege of Liaodong became a microcosm of everything wrong with Yang's grand strategy. The emperor's enormous army, so impressive on the march, proved unwieldy when concentrated around a single objective. Units got in each other's way, while the logistics of supplying so many men in a confined area created chaos that approached the farcical. Siege engines, laboriously transported hundreds of miles from China, proved inadequate against walls designed specifically to resist such weapons. Most frustratingly for Yang, his overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing when only a fraction of his force could actually engage the defenders at any given time. The Korean garrison, numbering perhaps a few thousand men, managed to tie down Yang's entire army for weeks through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of their defensive positions. Sorties launched at unexpected moments caught Chinese units off guard, while the fortress's sophisticated water and supply systems allowed the defenders to outlast their besiegers. Every day that passed weakened the Chinese position, as supplies dwindled and morale suffered under the constant stress of Korean harassment. Eventually, sheer persistence and sacrifice allowed Chinese forces to breach Liaodong's outer defenses, but the victory proved Pyrrhic in every sense. The casualties were staggering tens of thousands of Yang's best troops killed or wounded in frontal assaults against prepared positions. More ominously, the siege had consumed precious weeks of campaigning season, while the supply situation had deteriorated to crisis level. Korean defenders, following their predetermined strategy, had abandoned the fortress's inner citadel under cover of darkness, slipping away to fight another day while leaving behind only empty stone and bitter memories. As summer gave way to autumn, Yang's great army found itself scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, its units strung out along precarious supply lines that grew more vulnerable with each passing day. The emperor himself, witnessing firsthand the grinding reality of medieval warfare, began to show signs of the strain that his grand enterprise was imposing. Court observers noted that Yang's legendary temper was growing shorter, while his demands for aggressive action became increasingly unrealistic given the deteriorating situation on the ground. It was at this critical juncture that General Eulji Mundeok entered the stage of history, though his name meant nothing to the Chinese commanders who were about to encounter him. A career soldier who had risen through the ranks of the Goguryeo military through competence rather than birth, Eulji possessed the rare combination of tactical brilliance and strategic patience that marks truly great commanders. Unlike his Chinese counterparts, who were constrained by imperial expectations and court politics, Eulji enjoyed the complete confidence of King Yongyang and the freedom to conduct operations as he saw fit. Eulji's genius lay not in any single tactical innovation, but in his comprehensive understanding of how to turn Goguryeo's apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages. He recognized that Yang's massive army, for all its impressive size, was fundamentally vulnerable to the kind of warfare that Korean geography and circumstances demanded. The Chinese force was too large to be adequately supplied, too unwieldy to respond quickly to changing situations, and too dependent on conventional tactics to adapt to Korean innovations. The trap that Eulji was preparing would exploit every one of these vulnerabilities, drawing the Chinese army into a position where their superior numbers would become a liability rather than an asset. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages, a battle that would demonstrate that in warfare, as in so many aspects of human endeavor, bigger is not always better. The emperor's grand gamble was about to face its ultimate test, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of two armies, but the future of entire dynasties. The autumn winds of 612 carried with them the scent of coming winter and the weight of imperial desperation. Emperor Yang's grand army, once the pride of the Middle Kingdom, had become a ragged beast stumbling through the Korean mountains, its magnificent scale now transformed into a curse that devoured supplies faster than they could be replaced. For months, the Chinese forces had chased shadows through a landscape that seemed designed by malevolent gods to frustrate invaders' narrow valleys where cavalry could not deploy, swift rivers that turned to torrents without warning, and mountain passes where a handful of Korean defenders could hold up entire divisions. General Eulji Mundeok had spent those months studying his enemy with the patience of a master chess player contemplating his final gambit. From hidden observation posts scattered throughout the peninsula, His scouts had catalogued every weakness in the Chinese war machine: the predictable routes of supply convoys, the growing gaps between units as the army stretched itself across impossible distances, and most crucially, the increasing desperation of Chinese commanders who knew that winter's approach would doom any force still operating deep in Korean territory. The Chinese army that had crossed the Yalu with such magnificent confidence bore little resemblance to the force that now struggled through the autumn rains. Disease had claimed more victims than Korean spears, while desertion had thinned the ranks as men calculated that death as a fugitive was preferable to slow starvation in service to imperial ambition. The survivors moved with the hollow-eyed determination of men who knew they were trapped in a nightmare of their emperor's making, their only hope lying in some decisive victory that might justify the ocean of blood already spilled. Yang himself had aged years in the space of months, his imperial composure cracking under the weight of a campaign that had defied every prediction of his court astronomers and military advisors. The emperor, who had dreamed of easy conquest, now found himself commanding a retreating army, his grand strategy reduced to the desperate hope that one final push might salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions. His generals, those masters of court politics who had assured him of swift victory, now spoke in whispers of strategic withdrawals and limited objectives, their confidence evaporating like morning mist. It was in this atmosphere of creeping despair that Eulji Mundeok chose to reveal himself, emerging from the shadows like some spirit of Korean vengeance made flesh. The manner of his first contact with the Chinese command was itself a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a formal embassy complete with tribute bearers and diplomatic protocols, as if Goguryeo were ready to acknowledge Chinese suzerainty. The Korean general appeared before Yang's pavilion not as a defeated enemy seeking terms, but as a proud commander extending an offer of negotiation between equals. The meeting between Eulji and the Chinese High Command has passed into legend, though the exact details remain shrouded in the mists of conflicting accounts. What seems certain is that the Korean general presented himself as a reasonable man, one who recognized the futility of further resistance against such overwhelming Chinese might. He spoke eloquently of Goguryeo desire for peace, of King Yongyang's willingness to accept tributary status in exchange for the preservation of his kingdom's essential autonomy. To Chinese ears, accustomed to easy victory through superior numbers, Eulji's words seemed like the natural acknowledgement of defeat they had been expecting all along. Yet beneath the diplomatic courtesies, Eulji was conducting a careful reconnaissance of his enemies, cataloguing their weaknesses with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. He noted the hollow cheeks and haunted eyes that spoke of an army on the edge of starvation. He observed the nervous glances between Chinese commanders who had lost confidence in their emperor's grand design. Most importantly, he measured the arrogance that still lurked beneath their desperation, the fundamental inability of these court-bred generals to imagine that a barbarian kingdom might possess military capabilities beyond their comprehension. The negotiations, such as they were, proceeded according to a script that Eulji had written in his own mind. He played the role of the defeated enemy with consummate skill, offering just enough resistance to make the Chinese feel they were extracting real concessions while gradually maneuvering them toward the trap he had spent months preparing. The Korean general spoke of strategic positions that Goguryeo was willing to abandon, of fortresses that would be surrendered without resistance, of supply routes that would be opened to Chinese forces. Each concession seemed reasonable, even generous, to Chinese commanders who had grown accustomed to Korean intransigence. The bait that Ulji dangled before his enemies was irresistible in its apparent logic. A withdrawal of the main Chinese army to more defensible positions south of the Salsu River, where winter quarters could be established and supply lines consolidated for a renewed offensive in the spring. The Korean general painted a picture of strategic wisdom disguised as temporary retreat, suggesting that such a move would demonstrate Chinese magnanimity while positioning Yang's forces for decisive victory in the coming year. To emperors and generals who desperately needed a face-saving exit from an increasingly untenable position, Eulji's proposal seemed like divine intervention. What the Chinese commanders failed to understand was that they were not negotiating with a defeated enemy, but dancing to the tune of a master strategist who had already written the final act of their destruction. Eulji's apparent reasonableness was a mask concealing calculations of terrifying precision. He had studied the Chinese army's composition with the thoroughness of a scholar, noting which units retained their cohesion and which had been weakened by disease and desertion. He had mapped every mile of their projected route of withdrawal, identifying the precise points where geography would transform retreat into rout. The movement toward the Salsu River began in late autumn, as the first snows dusted the Korean mountains with harbingers of the killing winter to come. To the Chinese soldiers, weary beyond measure and haunted by months of futile campaigning, the order to withdraw came as a blessed relief. They had achieved nothing resembling victory, but at least they would live to see another spring. The massive army that had once stretched across the horizon like an unstoppable tide now resembled a wounded beast limping toward imagined safety, its units strung out across miles of treacherous terrain. Eulji's forces, invisible as mountain mists, shadowed the Chinese withdrawal with predatory patience. Korean cavalry units, operating in small groups that could appear and vanish like ghosts, maintained constant surveillance while avoiding direct engagement. These mounted scouts were the eyes and ears of coming destruction, reporting back to their commanders with detailed intelligence about Chinese movements, strengths, and most crucially, the growing disorder that characterized an army pushed beyond its limits. The Salsu River itself had been transformed by Korean engineering into an instrument of annihilation. Working under cover of darkness and using techniques passed down through generations of mountain warfare, Eulji's engineers had constructed a series of dams and diversions upstream from the main crossing point. These structures, invisible to Chinese scouts and disguised as natural features of the landscape, could release torrents of water at precisely calculated moments. The river that appeared fordable to advancing troops could become a raging torrent capable of sweeping away entire battalions. As the Chinese army approached the Salsu crossing in the grey dawn of what would become the most catastrophic day in their military history, they presented a target that exceeded Eulji's most optimistic calculations. Stretched out in a column that extended for miles, weakened by months of campaigning, and desperate to reach the safety of the southern bank, Yang's forces were psychologically and physically unprepared for the storm that was about to engulf them. The Korean general had timed his masterstroke with astronomical precision, waiting until the maximum number of Chinese troops were committed to the river crossing before springing his trap. The lead elements of Yang's army had reached the southern bank and were beginning to establish defensive positions when Eulji gave the signal that would transform tactical withdrawal into strategic catastrophe. Upstream, Korean engineers opened the hidden dams with coordinated precision, releasing the accumulated waters of autumn rains in a concentrated flood that struck the crossing points with the force of divine wrath. The artificial tsunami that roared down the Salsu Valley caught the Chinese army at its most vulnerable moment, with thousands of men trapped in the water and thousands more stranded on the northern bank. The carefully maintained formations that represented centuries of Chinese military tradition disintegrated in minutes as soldiers struggled against currents that swept away horses, equipment, and human beings with equal indifference. The organized retreat became a massacre as Korean forces, emerging from concealed positions like avenging spirits, fell upon the scattered survivors with methodical efficiency. General Eulji Mundeok commanded the slaughter from a hilltop overlooking the killing ground, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos unfolding below. This was not the wild bloodlust of barbarian raiders, but the calculated destruction of a professional soldier who understood that complete victory required the elimination of his enemy's capacity for future resistance. Korean archers, positioned at carefully selected vantage points, sent volleys of arrows into the masses of Chinese soldiers struggling in the floodwaters. Cavalry units swept down from the hills to cut off retreat routes and complete the encirclement of surviving units. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than a day, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. When the sun set over the Salsu River on that autumn evening in 612, the Korean forces had achieved something that military historians would struggle to comprehend: the virtual annihilation of an army that had outnumbered them by ratios that should have made defeat impossible. Of the 305,000 Chinese troops who had approached the river crossing that morning, Korean records claim that fewer than 3,000 survived to tell the tale of their destruction. The psychological impact of the Salsu massacre extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. shattering the myth of Chinese invincibility that had sustained imperial expansion for centuries. News of the disaster spread through Yang's remaining forces like a plague, triggering a collapse of morale that no amount of imperial rhetoric could repair. Units that had not participated in the crossing began to disintegrate as soldiers abandoned their posts and fled toward imagined safety in Chinese territory. The emperor's great army, reduced to scattered bands of demoralized fugitives, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Emperor Yang himself, witnessing the destruction of his grand design from the safety of his headquarters compound, suffered what courtiers would later describe as a complete breakdown of imperial composure. The ruler who had dreamed of easy conquest over barbarian kingdoms now confronted the reality that his own forces had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and destroyed by enemies he had dismissed as primitive savages. The astronomical costs of his Korean obsession, hundreds of thousands of lives, the treasure of multiple provinces, and the credibility of his dynasty had purchased nothing but humiliation and strategic catastrophe. Yet even this unprecedented disaster failed to cure Yang of his Korean fixation, demonstrating the particular madness that afflicts absolute rulers when reality refuses to conform to their desires. In the years following Salsu, the emperor would launch 2 more invasions of Goguryeo, each smaller and more desperate than the last, as if repetition might somehow reverse the verdict of geography and military competence. These final campaigns served only to complete the destruction of the Sui Dynasty, draining resources and manpower that might have been used to address the growing internal rebellions that were tearing apart Yang's empire. The revolts that erupted across China in the aftermath of the Korean disasters were not merely expressions of popular discontent, but fundamental challenges to the mandate of heaven itself. Peasants who had watched their sons march north to die in Korean mountains began to question whether Yang truly possessed divine approval for him. Local officials, bankrupted by the endless demands for men and supplies, found themselves unable to maintain order as bandit armies grew bolder and more numerous. The empire that Yang had inherited intact from his father began to fragment into competing warlord territories, each claiming to represent the true heir to Chinese civilization. The emperor's final years were a twilight struggle against enemies that multiplied faster than they could be defeated. Yang retreated from capital to capital as rebellion consumed province after province, his court reduced to a handful of sycophants who told him only what he wanted to hear. The grand palaces and magnificent public works that had seemed like monuments to eternal glory became empty shells, their corridors echoing with the footsteps of ghosts and the whispers of courtiers plotting their master's downfall. The end, when it came in 618, possessed a certain poetic justice that Chinese historians would later interpret as the inevitable consequence of challenging heaven's will. Yang met his death not on some heroic battlefield, but at the hands of his own generals during a palace coup that was as sordid as it was predictable. The dynasty that had reunified China after centuries of division lasted barely 37 years, its collapse hastened by an emperor's inability to accept the limitations that geography and military reality imposed on even the grandest imperial ambitions. In Korea, the victory over the Sui invasions became a foundational myth that would sustain the kingdom through future trials and tribulations. General Eulji Mundeok was elevated to the status of a national hero. His tactical brilliance at Salsu studied and celebrated by future generations of Korean military leaders. The successful defense against overwhelming odds demonstrated that Korean independence was not merely a geographical accident, but the product of superior leadership, military innovation, and the fierce determination of a people defending their homeland. The Goguryeo Wars had proven that in the grand chess game of East Asian geopolitics, numerical superiority and imperial arrogance were no match for strategic patience, tactical brilliance, and intimate knowledge of terrain. The mountains and rivers of Korea had swallowed Chinese armies whole, teaching lessons about the limits of power that would resonate far beyond the borders of the kingdoms involved. The dragon had fallen, its wings clipped by the sharp peaks of Korean mountains, and its fire extinguished in the cold waters of the Salsu River. Thus ended one of history's most catastrophic military campaigns, a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial overreach and the eternal truth that in war, as in life, pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. The Korean peninsula had proven itself a graveyard of Chinese ambitions, its soil enriched by the blood of armies that had marched north dreaming of easy conquest, and found instead only death and humiliation. The reverberations of these disasters would shape East Asian politics for centuries to come, a reminder that even the mightiest empires must bow before the immutable laws of geography, logistics, and human courage.